The accusation of being political is what led to my exploration of the poets of the 20th century who had endured conditions of extremity. And so I decided to restrict my study to poets who had endured conditions of extremity collectively inflicted through the depredations of the state, the failures of the state, or through warfare and so on. So I was interested in those who were incarcerated, those who endured military occupation, house arrest, forced exile, torture. And I found that outside the English-speaking world, most poets of the 20th century suffered some form of extremity. When I was making the presentation for the anthology's publication, the concept of a poetry of witness seemed difficult for the editors to whom I was making my appeal. So in order to help them, I told the story of one poet, and the poet I chose was Miklos Radnoti, who was the foremost Hungarian poet of his generation. In 1944, Miklos Radnoti was force-marched into the country that would become and once was Yugoslavia to do military forced labor. The Nazis, toward the end of the war, made peculiar decisions. Historians are still studying these decisions. Decisions to evacuate this camp and send all the prisoners to another camp. One of these decisions was to force march 2,000 of these slave laborers from Yugoslavia back into Hungary, among them the poet Miklos Radnoti, who chose to be with the first column. And before he left, he was able to obtain a small notebook. No one knows how. Force-marched in the snow with a unit of German soldiers back into Hungary with this notebook. They get across the Hungarian border and there are only 22 survivors of that march, among them Radnoti. The German soldiers wanted to get back to their units, and so they saw a hospital across the Hungarian border, and they tried to leave these 22 prisoners in that hospital, but the Hungarians barred the door. They were full, they were frightened, they didn't want anything to do with this. So the German soldiers took these 22 people to the forest and executed them. They buried them in a shallow grave, common grave. 2 years after the war, Miklos Radnoti's widow, Fanny Radnoti, went with the fellow villagers to this site in the forest, and they exhumed the bodies themselves and laid the bodies out on the field. And Fanny Radnoti went from corpse to corpse until she found her husband. He had been in the ground for 2 years. She went through the pockets of his clothing, pulled out the little notebook, peeled the pages apart, and dried them in the sun. And they held the last of his poems, the poems written on the forced march. And those were the poems I wanted to publish in Against Forgetting, 20th Century Poetry of Witness. So that volume begins with the Armenian genocide and it ends at Tiananmen Square, because Tiananmen Square was the last event before I published the book. And this volume begins with a quote from Bertolt Brecht: "In the dark times will there also be singing. Yes, there will be singing about the dark times." And then at the end, 145 poets later, writing from 30 languages, across time, across national borders, there's another Brecht quote, which is, "This then is all. It's not enough, I know. At least I'm still alive, as you can see. I'm like the man who took a brick to show how beautiful his house used once to be." There were very many quite astonishing things about this poetry when it's studied together, when it's collected and read as a whole body, rather than as separate works by poets living in different times and different literary cultures. It seemed to me that sometimes it was almost like a symphony of utterance, you know, a world voicing of what it meant to be a human being in the 20th century and now in the 21st. Past 1 o'clock. You must have gone to bed. The Milky Way streams silver through the night. I'm in no hurry. With lightning telegrams, I have no cause to wake or trouble you. And, as they say, the incident is closed. Love's boat has smashed against the daily grind. Now you and I are quits. Why bother then to balance mutual sorrows, pains, and hurts? Behold what quiet settles on the world. Night wraps the sky in tribute from the stars. In hours like these, one rises to address the ages, history, and all creation. Some people, that was his last poem. It was written just before he took his own life. Some people feel that it was written as a suicide note.